Welcome to the January 2021 Beginner's Fly Tying session. Of course, this is the first session of this new year, but I'm thinking back at the fact that we've been doing this virtually for almost a full year. And I really enjoy doing this and knowing that so many of our club members and even new members are getting the benefit of learning how to tie in a virtual type of setting. So today's pattern, which I've chosen, is called the egg-sucking leech. Now, just to give you a very brief history of the egg-sucking leech, in case you hadn't read our most recent newsletter, this particular pattern has been around for probably over 200 years because in doing a little bit of history about this pattern, I learned that there was reference to certain types of flies in the late or mid 1700s that referred to a leech-like fly hooking itself to an egg, presumably from one of the fish eggs from the salmonoid family. And salmonoids, of course, include our trout, various species, as well as steelhead, and even salmon species themselves are referred to as salmonoids. But so we're going to tie this egg-sucking leech today, and so as I already mentioned, it represents a leech, but so do woolly buggers. I mean, often when we're teaching the very basic woolly bugger, we say, well, what does the woolly bugger really represent? Well, we don't know exactly what the fish sees when it puts its mouth around or sees an imitation of a woolly bugger. It may be a leech to them, it may be a worm, it may be a minnow of some type. But for years, one of the most effective flies has been a woolly bugger. And so the egg-sucking leech is nothing more than a woolly bugger with an egg at the front or near the eye of the hook. Now, in a recent month, those who took part of the beginner's fly tying session learned to tie an egg pattern. And so in today's instruction, I'm going to show you basically how to tie the egg-sucking leech using different materials for representing the egg. And at the end of the basic tying, I'm going to show you how to do this with the yarn that was used when we tied the egg pattern just a month or so ago. So that is the way to get started in this. And so what is going to be different about the way we do this tying today? And why did I choose this particular pattern? Because after all, almost everybody would say, yes, I know how to tie a woolly bugger. Well, that's not necessarily so, because if one Googles how to tie a woolly bugger, you come up with as many patterns as you can, count on two hands and all of your toes, because there's various ways of tying a woolly bugger. And so there's probably various ways of tying an egg-sucking leech. But what we're going to be doing today is we're going to be introducing a couple other added features to the basic egg-sucking leech. One of them is a reflective type of material that's going to be incorporated into the tail of the fly to give it a little bit of flash. And the other thing is the incorporation of a underwrap of lead-free wire that's going to allow the fly to sink rather quickly, because after all, if this is an egg-sucking leech, in fact, as in the natural form, one would probably find it along the bottom of the stream where there are eggs, fish eggs. So these additional features probably make the egg-sucking leech more fishable. And what I mean by that is that there are going to be certain conditions where the egg-sucking leech is going to outperform just the standard woolly bugger. And one of our longtime members, Karen Baker, who is our club secretary, is an advocate of the egg-sucking leech. And so you will often see Karen using that pattern and on certain days out fishing everybody else that might be just using a regular woolly bugger. And we're also going to introduce a couple of new materials that would be used in construction of the egg itself, which also makes it more a simpler pattern, a simpler fly to tie. And so with that as sort of our introduction, the next thing I'm going to talk about is how to select various materials for a pattern such as the egg-sucking leech. And in doing so, I will talk about the principal components of this fly. Well, first of all, we're going to be using, again, a fly hook, a streamer type hook. This is the 7041 that is sold by the Fly Shack, and it is made by the Sabre company. And I'm going to be using a size 6 streamer hook for this fly, as I generally do for most of the flies that I tie that are in the woolly bugger sort of family. We're also going to be using lead-free wire. In this particular case, it's a .030 diameter, which pretty much matches the diameter of the hook that I just described. So the tail of the fly is going to be marabou. And marabou, of course, is from a chicken or some type of a fowl. And it represents the tail feathers of that particular type of chicken or fowl, whatever. So we're going to be using black marabou in tying today's fly. And what I would like to do before I go any further is give you an example of 3 marabou feathers and explain why one should be somewhat selective in choosing the marabou. This is the one that we're going to use, and as you can see, it has a lot of very small fibers that come off the principal or the main shank of the feather itself. Here is one that is much narrower. It's not as fluffy because it has a very stiff stem inside. And so it's not going to perform as well in the current or in the water as you're retrieving the streamer or working the fly in whatever body of water you're fishing in. So we don't want to select that type of feather, nor do we want to select one that looks like this. And as you can see, it's not as fibrous as the first one I showed you. It also has some constrictions. And when it's tied in, that's going to be very evident in the flies, the tail of the fly. So again, as you're going through a particular marabou clump, and this is what we generally refer to as strung marabou because it is fastened together with a sort of a thread type of material. Please be selective when you are selecting which particular marabou feather that you're going to tie your flies with, because you want one that's going to give you a lot of motion in the fly itself. So with that said, then we're going to be using black marabou. For the main part of the abdomen of the fly, we're going to be using saddle hackle, and again, this is going to be black to match the color of the abdomen of the fly. And so I've chose one that's going to illustrate or provide sort of a nice thick diameter around the abdomen of the fly. So, and you want one that's relatively long so that you can get a lot of wraps around the shank of the hook. So The other thing that we're going to be using to enhance the appearance of the fly is this Flashaboo. And Flashaboo, if you're not familiar with working with it, is a tinsel-like material. I can recall having something like this on my Christmas tree when I was growing up. And so it probably was adapted from Christmas tree tinsel. And then when it was realized that it would be a good material to use in fly tying, Flashaboo really hit the market. And Crystal Flash is another very similar type of flashy material which could also be used in tying this fly. What I want to show you, and you'll see me do this as I start to tie the fly, is rather than pulling all of the Flashaboo out of the covering that it comes with, I generally will cut a little slit in the side of the Flashaboo package. And that way I'm only pulling out the fibers that I need to use rather than dealing with a big bundle in my hand. So there's a small opening there, and you'll see me pulling out a couple fibers with a pair of forceps, and you just pull out the ones you need and the rest of them remain nice and straight inside the package. So I think that I've now covered most all of the components of the egg-sucking leech, except to say that you'll see me finishing off the egg portion of the fly with this chenille. And of course, chenille comes in multiple colors. And here's just another illustration. If you want the egg to be, rather than a bright sort of reddish material or a pinkish material, you could go with something like this chenille that is a little variegated and it has some orange in it, because fish eggs vary in color from pink to orange to bright red depending upon the species. And often when we're tying egg patterns, we will tie them in various colors just because we're not sure what particular egg is going to really excite the fish's interest. Several weeks ago, after our club stocked one of our local streams, I was very successful with using just a regular egg, and I found that the orange egg was, on that particular day, was the best thing that I could offer to the fish, because they certainly liked it. And I'll always remember that day. But I'm getting off the topic. So we're going to get started now. And so I've now introduced the materials. And you will, as a participant, will be receiving each of these materials so that you can tie at least 2 different egg-sucking leeches. Well, let's get started tying the egg-sucking leech. Now, I've already put into my vise this size 6 streamer hook. Of course, I bent down the hook, the barb on the hook before putting it in to the vise. And you want to make sure each time that you do insert a hook into a vise, regardless of what fly you're tying, that you have your vise tight. Because just as a tip, you don't want to be halfway through the fly and your hook begins to slip out of the vise, because that's a terrible situation to be in, because you don't know what to do first, whether you straighten the hook or whether you sort of tie everything off. So I've made that mistake many times, so I'm just passing along that suggestion to you all. Now, the first thing that I'm going to be doing is I'm going to be applying several lead wraps, several wraps of lead around the shank of the hook. And as I mentioned before, I'm going to be using this lead-free wire, this .030, which I have matched pretty much to be about the same as the diameter of the hook shank. And that's sort of a general rule of thumb. When you are weighting a fly, you want to choose your lead wrap or whatever you're using to weight it down to be approximately the same diameter as the hook shank. And that way you're applying enough and you're not applying too much to be able to sink that particular hook. Now, I'm saving the very front of the hook for the application of the head of the fly. So I will be starting my lead wraps back about mid-shank, making, and I'll count them off as I do this, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, about 10 wraps. Now that I have that on the bare shank of the hook, I'm going to just helicopter it at this end to break it off, so I get a nice break off point, push it together, and make a few more wraps with this free end. Push that together, and then pinch it down with my needle nose pliers. Now you'll see in other videos on the internet different ways of cutting off the wires. Some people use a wire cutter such as this, some helicopter it, some just simply break it off, some use their thumbnail. It's whatever you get used to, and so you don't necessarily have to follow each of these steps exactly the way I do it, because I've developed my own style over the years, and you will too. You need to have confidence in yourself and your tying skills, and of course practice makes perfect. And so, believe it or not, even though I had at one time a small job, if you want to call it that, tying woolly buggers for one of the local fly tying stores or fly fishing stores, and I probably tied hundreds of dozens of flies, woolly buggers. It gets to be quite monotonous, but nevertheless, even before putting together today's instruction, I tied a couple woolly buggers just so that I could make it look like I knew what I was doing. So, okay, I'm now going to take my tying thread and make several wraps in front of the lead, which actually will act sort of as a dam to keep the lead wraps from sliding forward. And then I'll push that lead up against those thread wraps, and now begin to wrap my thread back over the lead wire, pushing it again tight, and then making several wraps behind where the lead is positioned. And I'm going to clip off my excess thread, and then continue to make wraps back until I get just about to the bend of the hook or right above the barb of the hook. All right, so now we have the thread in place, we have the wire in place, and I am going to use that particular piece of hackle that I had mentioned before. And before actually starting to tie this in, we want to always measure the length of the materials that we're using. And so, as we traditionally would do for a woolly bugger, we begin to stroke back that marabou feather until we get about as much marabou between my finger and my thumb as the shank of the hook, and then I measure it against the shank of the hook, and you can see that's about the same length. So traditionally, the tail on a woolly bugger or on the egg-sucking leech is going to be equivalent to the shank of the hook. Now I will transfer this from my right hand to my left hand, put it immediately over where the thread is hanging, use a little pinch wrap to get that started, hold that in place, making 4 or 5 wraps. Now, so my tail is in place, and what I want to do is next is get rid of this material. So I measure the forward part of this marabou to be just about where the lead was anchored in, and I can now discard that material. By the way, a little bit later I'll tell you what you might want to do with your excess marabou fibers, because they don't always need to be thrown in the trash. There's a number of different uses for them. And so the first thing I'm going to do now that I've clipped that off is wrap my thread forward over that marabou And that creates sort of a base for the fibers that we're going to be installing next. Well, not next, but very shortly. I'll bring my thread almost back to the bend of the hook. Now it's just about where the point of the hook is. And I'm going to take several fibers of the Flashabou from the package, pulling out 3, clipping them off, and then while holding them in my left hand, and I'm going to extend this thread a little bit, I'm wrapping the filaments of the Flashabou around the thread as it's hanging down. And now I've grasped both ends of the Flashabou in my left hand, and I'm holding it on the side of the fly facing myself. All right, so then I begin to make wraps back over that Flashabou towards the bend of the hook. And that secures it on the near side of the hook, right along in parallel with the hook shank itself. Notice that I've still kept the hold of, or retained hold of, these Flashabou fibers, so that I'll be able to measure them to be no longer than the marabou before clipping them off. And now that I've done that on the near side of the hook, I'm going to repeat the process on the far side. Again, I'm going to take several of these Flashabou fibers, and I'll clip them off. And again, I will wrap them around the thread, hold them in my left hand, bring them around to the far side of the hook, and tie it in the same way. So instead of having these Flashabou fibers on the top or the bottom, I've basically put them along both sides of the fly, which is probably more representative of what a fish would see if it looked at a minnow. We would see some sort of a lateral line along the side of the minnow or whatever the bait is that we're trying to imitate. All right, so that's now in place. I'm going to wrap my thread just a couple wraps forward, and I'll explain why when I go to the next step. And that next step is to take a piece of chenille. In this case, I've chosen black chenille. Now, this is not to say that you can't construct an egg-sucking leech out of some other color material. You could probably use olive or brown or something dark in color, but I would expect that you would probably choose a color that's going to more like represent the color of a leech, which leeches are generally from black to sort of cinnamon brown, some color like that. I'm going to take about 2 inches of this, strip off the very end filaments as we normally do with a woolly bugger construction. And these 2 small filaments that are on the inside of chenille, I'm going to lay that right over the space where my thread is hanging and anchor those filaments in place using a pinch wrap. And notice what I'm doing next. I'm wrapping back over those filaments so that my thread ends up exactly above the barb of the hook as where we tied in the other materials. And I'm leaving the chenille on the far side of the hook, and that's towards the camera. And so it's out of the way, and I'll explain why I did that very shortly. But the next thing I'm going to do before we advance that chenille forward is I'm going to make several wraps forward, and then I've selected a single feather of saddle hackle. And if you're not that familiar, I'm going to go over the basics of hackle very quickly. There's really 2 types of hackle, and it's based upon where that feather is on the chicken or the type of fowl. if it's on the back, and if you think of it such as a saddle is on a horse, the feathers that are on the back of a chicken, let's say, are representing the saddle hackle. The feathers which are on the neck of the pheasant or the chicken or whatever type of fowl it is, those are considered neck hackle. And neck hackle is traditionally used for dry flies, whereas saddle hackle is used for wet flies and streamers because it's not as stiff. And so it's much more pliable than is neck hackle, which would be used to help in the flotation of a dry fly, for example. So now that I've gone through that, notice that I'm taking this saddle hackle by the tip and I'm stroking back the fibers on the saddle hackle itself. And I will be tying in this feather by the tip. So I will lay that feather flat with the concave side down, right along my side of the hook, and making several wraps around that tip, wrapping it forward, and just clipping off a little bit of that excess. Just there. Now I'm going to advance my thread forward right to the point where I had stopped the lead wraps, right about there. Notice that I had tied in the chenille first. And this is sort of contrary to the old idiom that you always tie in last the material that you're going to wrap forward first. Now, I don't expect you to remember that, but I'm going to explain my logic here. I tied in the chenille, which is going to be the next thing that I tie forward, but I tied that in before the saddle hackle. For this reason, before I advance this chenille forward, I'll be able to make one wrap immediately behind the saddle hackle, which then buries the saddle hackle underneath the chenille and makes it less cumbersome at the rear of the fly. So now that I've done that one half of a wrap behind the saddle hackle, I'll begin to make my wraps forward. And each of these wraps should be not on top of each other, but exactly right in front of the previous one. So I could do this with the feature of my fly tying vise, but I prefer, because of this instruction, to do it with my hand itself. Now that I've wrapped the chenille forward, I'm going to secure it with several thread wraps immediately behind that piece of chenille that's still sticking up, a couple wraps in front of it, and then I will clip off this excess. All right. Now, just for safety's sake, I'm going to put in a half hitch just to secure my thread, not because I expect it to come apart, but it's always good when you're starting out tying flies to put in a half hitch occasionally in the construction of your fly to keep everything together. Now I'm going to just move the arm of my vise over to pull the thread out of the way. And the next thing we're going to do is we're going to be wrapping the hackle forward. And in this particular case, I will use the rotary feature of my fly tying vise. But notice that what I will be doing is I'm keeping the feather flat. In other words, I'm not allowing the feather to twist and become sort of a rope type structure. In this way, the fibers of the hackle will continue to stick out as I'm wrapping forward. And if I were doing this by hand, it would still be the same process. And I could give that as an example by wrapping the rest of this by hand, but I'm keeping that feather flat all the time I'm wrapping it forward until I get to the very front, but only as far forward as my lead wraps And I'll pull this out of the way and make 2 to 3 wraps behind the hackle and 2 to 3 in front. And then I can clip that off. All right. Now I'm pulling this back out of the way just to be able to give you a good view of the amount of space that I have left at the front for putting in the material that's going to represent the egg. And what I have chosen for this particular fly that I'm demonstrating today is this chenille. And by the way, chenille comes in 3 sizes. There's a small, medium, and a large. And so most of the packages of chenille that you buy will tell you what the diameter is. And so to give you an example, this is referred to as large. However, it's not as large as some that I've seen. This one that I'm next to it is medium, and then the small you would only use on very small flies. So I will take about an inch and a half of this material, and again strip out the very tip, exposing these 2 little filaments. I did want to stop at this point and tell you that you have your option, and I will show you how to do this. You have your option of, notice that to this point I have used black thread because it matches the color of the tail and the abdomen. But suppose we don't want to have black thread all the way up to the tip. Well, this is a good point then where you could terminate your black thread with a few either half hitches or whip finish, clip it off, and introduce then another thread. Again, this is 6/0 that is in a brighter color that clearly matches the color of the chenille I'm using. So I just start that thread right behind the eye of the hook and wrap it back to where I had finished off the black thread. And now I'm ready to tie in the chenille. Again, I want to be able to trap those 2 little threads with my tying thread. And now notice the next thing that I will be doing. I've only wrapped my thread partially forward to the eye. I still have a very small space that is behind the eye. And what I have found is that helps me be able to build up the head of the fly into a ball before moving it forward. Then when I have made my 3rd wrap, I'm basically pulling the thread forward to right behind the eye of the hook. I can make several wraps right there, lift this up, make several wraps underneath, and then I could use a half hitch tool to finish off the head of the fly underneath and around the eye of the hook. Several half hitches like that. And we can clip the thread, and we can clip off the head of the fly, and there you have finished an egg-sucking leech using chenille. Now, this is not to say that you can't substitute other things. I have tied this particular pattern with polyarn. I'll give you an example of one tied with polyarn. You can see it's not as robust, but you still get the same effect with polyarn. And you can tie it in other colors, as I mentioned before. So what I'm going to be doing is a shortened version of this same fly, but with some egg yarn. And so I will end up with a similar looking pattern, this one tied with egg yarn. And to do that, rather than tying the entire fly, I have already pre-tied the woolly bugger aspect of this next example for you, and I'm just going to substitute it into my hook vise and commence as if I were tying the egg-sucking leech with egg yarn material. So I'll take the existing fly out, put this other one in, and the next thing I will do is restart the thread. Okay. Now I've selected the 2 pieces of egg yarn. They don't really need to be that long, so I'm going to clip this off somewhat. And much in the same way that we did an egg pattern just a month or so ago, I now have about a 1 inch or slightly more than 1 inch of the egg yarn. My thread is in place for application of the egg yarn material. I'm going to hold this up in the air. I'm going to wrap that egg yarn once around the thread, holding it with my left hand. I'm coming down and I'm making 1 wrap around the shank of the hook and then drawing this down. Now the egg yarn is sitting right up on top of the hook itself. And then I will make several wraps around the base of the egg yarn, just so that it's nice and tight and secure there. Make a couple more wraps in front, and then I can finish off my thread by cutting my thread. I can secure that in place. And now the egg yarn material is already in position. Then I'll pull up rather stoutly on the egg yarn itself and clip it off parallel to the hook shank, about like so. And then with my fingers, I can work that egg yarn around the front of the hook, thus representing a nice egg on the front of this leech. And so there you have it. At least 2 different ways that you can tie an egg-sucking leech. And so one of the great things about fly tying is experimentation. So don't hesitate to try different colors, to try different methods of constructing the head of the fly. I've given you 2 methods right here today. So now that we've tied this fly today, and actually tied 2 of them, let me talk just for a very brief moment or 2 about how to fish the egg-sucking leech. As you notice, we tied in some lead or lead-free wraps to help sink the fly. Of course, that avoids having to put a bead head on or having to put lead on your leader itself. So we've already demonstrated how to get this fly to sink deeper. That's not to say that you shouldn't put or couldn't put a piece of lead or lead substitute somewhere about maybe 6 inches up from the leech. It will help not only get the leech down, but it will also help in the movement of the leech as you retrieve it. So normally, when I fish the egg-sucking leech or any type of woolly bugger structured type fly, I will generally cast across the current, let the current take the fly down, keeping the line sort of somewhat tight, but not overly tight, allowing the fly to swing in the current. And then as the fly comes to the end of your leader, so to speak, it will naturally start to rise in the current because of the buoyancy of the water that's rushing past the fly. And that's the perfect time then to not just let the fly sort of lie in the current, sweeping back and forth a little bit, so it simulates a leech or a type of minnow trying to struggle and swim up against the current. But it's also a good time to put a little bit of movement into the tip of your rod to make sort of an undulation of your rod, and so the line. And so it's giving sort of a three-dimensional motion to the fly at the end of your leader. Now, there's another way of fishing a fly such as this, and that would be to cast across the current and then strip the fly out towards the opposite bank, and then strip the fly towards you, but then let it hang in the current. So this way, if there's a fish that's closer to the opposite bank, you're going to draw that fish away from the bank in pursuit of the egg-sucking leech or the woolly bugger. But then if you stop about mid-current, during that hesitation will be when the minnow or the fly itself sort of swings in the current, and that's also going to pick up any fish that might be lying in the middle of the stream or in the deeper current. So don't hesitate to pick and try different methods, but I've given you two ways that I traditionally will fish a woolly bugger or an egg-sucking leech or some other type of a streamer, and that's against the far bank or right out in the current. But let the fly do its work. All you need to do is put a little bit of motion into it. And what's neat about fishing with streamers is the fish will hook themselves. You don't have to worry about setting the hook, because you'll get a hard strike and they'll generally set the hook. As long as your hook is sharp, that fish will be on. So hope that you'll take these little tips to advice and give them a try when you go fishing next with a streamer type of fly. Well, I hope that you enjoyed today's fly tying session and the instruction that we've provided to you. As I may have told you in the past, I've been tying flies for several decades, and I'm always learning something new. And that's one of the most fascinating things about fly tying, is that it's not only a relaxing type of activity, but you're always learning, and there's always that quest to tie better flies, or to try new patterns, or to try new materials, or try even different ways of tying a particular fly. So I hope that you enjoyed today's session, and that I've given you some new thoughts about just tying this relatively simple fly, but the fact that we've introduced new materials and new ways of doing it, and perhaps proper way of doing it, that should enhance your fly tying. Before we finish up, I did want to make reference to, you probably noticed that I'm wearing this particular shirt today. Our club is the sponsor of a local Project Healing Waters chapter in Frederick, Maryland. And the veterans of the European wars, recent wars in the Middle East, that's, for example, are the recipients of various things that people in our hobby, so to speak, our pastime, have been doing to help them out. These individuals, these men and women, may be suffering from physical or other debilitating types of trauma from their experiences. And so I just wanted to sort of reach out to the folks that are might be watching this, and realize that there's a lot of people that have given their best, their lives, for the freedoms that we have, and one of those freedoms is being able to fish freely wherever we care to go, at least in this country. And so I would suggest or make mention of the fact that if there's something that you'd like to do in a local organization, whether you're here in the Frederick area or whether you're somewhere else in the United States, and you want to help out some of our veterans, I strongly encourage you to do that. It's very easy to do, and it doesn't take much of your time, and it's a very rewarding experience. So tight lines to you all, and thank you very much.